Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Firepower Saved the Day by Bon Scott 420. This story took place back in the late 1990s. My brother and some friends used to go camping and fishing and shooting at a piece of land owned by a friend's family. It was out in the middle of nowhere and butted up against some state preserves, with the only little town about 5 miles away. To get to where we would camp, you left a 2-lane country route, took a paved road that eventually turned into a dirt road, and then turned into an even more dirt road, if that makes sense. There were a few hunting cabins here and there, and even a couple of permanent residents way out, but for the most part it was just sprawling fields and forest. This time we went out there, it was my brother, who I'll call R, our friend T, and another friend G. We had stocked up on food and drinks and were planning on staying there for a long weekend, Thursday to Sunday in late August. We arrived and set up our campsite in a little clearing in some woods far away from the dirt road that led us there. Where we were, if you were driving by to the preserve or just passing through, you'd never even knew we were out there. This was always a great time of guys just being guys, staying up late around a campfire, getting up and fishing and swimming, target and pigeon shooting, and hiking around the area to explore what was out there. All right, before the nuts come out of the woodwork, I'm talking about clay target pigeons, not real ones. We had brought along quite an arsenal, and usually did, as this was the one time every year we got together, and wanted to show one another anything new we had purchased or otherwise obtained. One year G brought an old musket, and other years someone had brought a new handgun for everyone to try. And of course there was always the new fishing tackle that would really catch the fish. Yeah, right. This time out I had brought my AKM, my brother had his Colt AR-15, T had brought a Ruger of which I can't remember what model, and there were other shotguns and pistols for everyone to shoot. I only mention the rifles specifically as they play a part in this story. And now, before everyone brings out the anti-gun stuff, let me just say that none of us have these weapons anymore, and that I totally understand why people don't want others having access to them. I came to realize that I only shot mine on occasions like this, and my money was better invested in my collection of competition shotguns. The tragedies happening in our country and around the world right now are horrific, and while I am NRA, I may be the only one who thinks there should be stiffer regulations for owning these weapons. Anyway, back to the story. So there we were, having fun in the sun, and after shooting at some paper targets, we took a swim in the pond and then started to think about dinner as it was in the afternoon. I volunteered to cook and got to work setting up the fire to make some steak and potatoes, and the other guys went off to hike around the land and check out some spots we rarely went to. So, alone, I cracked a beer and waited to get a decent bed of coals going. I was sitting in a chair reading a Stephen King book when I got that creepy feeling someone was watching me. I looked around and saw nothing and went back to reading. But that feeling came again, and then I heard a twig snap behind me, and just as I was unholstering my Smith & Wesson 9mm, I turned around and heard a voice call out. It was just Pete, a guy who lived out here not too far from our campsite. I sighed a sigh of relief and stood up to greet him and offered him a beer. Pete was a little weird, but a good enough guy. He just liked living far away from everything after his wife passed away a few years earlier. He had heard us shooting and wanted to come over and say hi. After a bit, we heard the guys coming back, and there was a lively discussion with Pete about what had been going on out here and so on. We invited Pete to stay for dinner and into the night as we kept talking and putting back the beers. Around midnight, we decided to turn in and head for our tents, and sleep was easy, but I woke up to more twigs breaking softly and soft footsteps. Then there was the snuffling, and I whispered to T, whose tent was right next to mine. Hey, hear that? Yep, just coyotes checking us out. Don't sweat it, he said. This was usual for out here, but beyond that I heard something else I didn't mention. Heavier footsteps, and I swear whispering, and maybe a whistle? I knew there was a whistle, and I knew it wasn't any bird or animal, but I just rolled over to feel my shotgun just in case. Eventually the sounds died down and I went back to sleep. The next morning I got up to find my brother messing with the Coleman propane stove, and I mentioned the sounds to him. He hadn't heard anything, and he decided to run back into the little town to get a couple more propane canisters, as we used one in the lantern the night before, and another one we brought was empty. He took off, and G&T got up, and we went to take a swim and a shower at a pond. I went when they got back, and my brother finally showed up and made breakfast. It was another fun day of just being outside, and G surprised us with his gift to the trip. A box of tracer rounds. I had never shot them, and thought that would be cool to do right at dusk before it would be illegal to shoot in the dark. Fast forward to that evening, and while we were getting another fire stoked for a round of grilled chicken, we shot a few of those rounds of tracers at some targets, and it was pretty cool to see the colored lines from the shots zoom through the dusk. More beer flowed that night, and just as the fire was dying down, we heard more twigs snapping off in the woods near us. Now, we weren't paranoid, but we were familiar with the sounds out here, and we knew this wasn't deer, and we could hear the coyotes yipping far away as they made their rounds. G spoke up and said, "Did you guys hear a whistle?" None of us had, and we shook our heads. But then we did hear another one, and then another. They were all coming from different spaces around us, mostly behind us, coming from the direction of the pond. We were all dead silent as we heard more movement, and then a voice fairly distant call out, "Yoo-hoo, boys! Can we come over to play?" My brother looked at me dead in the eyes, and then at G&T. There was laughter and more sounds of movement. Then 3 more whistles. There were 3 people out there moving towards us, signaling one another with the whistling as to where they were. T pointed in 3 different directions as to where he thought they were standing or moving, and my brother nodded. Whistles came again, and another voice said, "It's awfully quiet over there. What's the matter, boys?" And then a freaky laugh rang out. T spoke up. "You're on private property and you're not welcome here. Leave." Silence. Then more movement. "That's not very hospitable of you boys," said a voice. "We're all nice guys, ain't that right?" More laughter. They were getting closer, but were still out of the light of our lantern and fire. My brother pointed at our rifle bags and then at our targets that were off to the left of where these people were coming from. I knew what he meant, and so did T. G spoke up. "Seriously, this isn't cool. You're trespassing. Turn around and leave now." More silence. "How about a beer before you hand over your shit?" said the voice. Now the sounds of steps were much closer. And by this time we had all armed ourselves with our rifles, and I should point out that all of them had 30-round magazines loaded. My brother pointed at our targets once again and whispered, "Shoot below them into the ground and go full pack. That'll scare them off." We were already a little spread out and raised our rifles quietly, and my brother counted down from 3, and we let the lead fly. 120 rounds just blasting away at tree stumps and the ground. I had forgotten I had left tracer rounds in my magazine, and that made the firepower all that more dramatic. It sounded like a war zone, and for nearly 20 seconds or so the deafening sound of semi-automatic fire filled the night. We never got the chance to hear whoever it was running away, but when the echoes died down, all was silent in the woods. We all remained quiet with the buzzing in our ears, and we didn't have time to put on our ear protection. I fished some beers out of the cooler, and after a bit we heard someone coming from the direction of our vehicles. It was Pete, wondering what the fuck was going on. T told them what had happened and why we had done what we did. He shook his head and wondered aloud who was out there, and whoever it was, they were not up to continuing to fuck with us that night, I can guarantee you. We all stayed up around the fire, eating and drinking more beer, listening for a return of whoever was out there, but they were long gone. When first light came, we fanned out into the forest in the direction of where we heard the voices and searched around us for clues as to who it was. G found a very large Bowie knife that he actually kept and still has, and my brother found the coup de grace, a pair of soiled pants. Someone, in their haste to run away, had shit their drawers last night. We all voted on staying the rest of the weekend, and I went into town to the little store to get some more beer and water. While I was in there, the shopkeeper Ray, who we'd known for years, asked if our friends had found us. "What friends?" I asked. "Oh, the four guys that came in the other day asking where you were camping. Said they missed your meetup back in town and couldn't remember where you were staying. The four guys with the long hair." I looked at Ray and said, "Those weren't our friends, Ray." I then asked him if he had told them where we were. He put his head down and nodded. Said, "Yeah, I'm sorry." His face was white, and he kept apologizing, but I told him to forget it. When I got back to the camp, I relayed the info to the guys, and everyone just shook their heads. The rest of the weekend was quiet, and we had a good time, but we kept going over and over what had happened and wondering who those guys were, how they knew we were out there, and what they were up to. Our group doesn't really get together that much anymore. Life got in the way, and families took priority over hangouts in the woods. My brother and I still shoot competitively, and I do see him more often than anybody else. I heard Pete passed away last summer, and I've only been out to our camping spot a couple of times since that last trip. What we did was dangerous that night, but I am convinced that was the best way to scare off someone who clearly had bad intentions. Crazy Girlfriend and Mom, submitted by Cheeto Bleedo. When I was in junior high school, I remember everything being such high drama with all the girls at the time. There were always fights between them, girls arguing over guys, and the cliques that would remain throughout high school forming at that age, and all the while the guys just wanted a little action. Sure, there were the occasional fights over a girl and angry young guy stuff, but not to the extent of what the girls were up to. This is a story of a little slice of that life. Our school was 7th and 8th grade back then, in the mid-'80s. I think it's changed now, but whatever. I had a girlfriend since the summer before, but suddenly she was in this other group of friends, and I was on the outs, it seemed. Not really sure why. I had the same group of friends. I was a really good wrestler and runner, did well in school, was into bands, skateboarding, and all that 80s jazz. Just a regular guy that was honest to goodness friends with everyone. Smart kids, the heads, the jocks, the band guys. I got along with everyone. Except Tara, apparently. Tara wanted to separate for a bit, which I thought was screamingly funny at the time. Like, really? We're frickin' 13 or 14 years old, and she's talking like we were adults, not sure if we should divorce. I got razzed big time by my teammates over this. If I screwed up a reverse or whatever, the guys would yell that I gave my opponent too much separation. And one time during a match that happened, I started laughing and almost lost because of it. Our coach reamed us out on the bus home from that meet, I assure you. So, Tara wants to separate. I say fine, and I later find out that someone in her new clique said that the older high school guys would want to date them when we moved up there next year. I should have been insulted, but I just let it flow and I didn't get too upset, even though I probably was a little busted up inside. Well, then, one day, after practice, I was running laps around the middle school with my teammates. It was a Thursday and we had a meet on Saturday, so it had been a hard workout, and I was tired and not paying attention as we ran. All the guys were talking about the snowball dance that Saturday, and of course the comedians were asking if I had any space in my life for it, or if I was separating myself from it. I probably said bite me or something like that, and for a split second looked over to the side where they were. When I looked up, BAM! I slammed face first into a locker door that had just been opened. I landed on my back, and the guys went into hysterical laughter. I was nearly out, and all I can remember to this day was this funny blonde image hovering over me. It was Candace, Candy for short, a new girl at school. She kept saying she was sorry, and she wasn't paying attention to who was coming down the hall. Yeah, she had a Walkman on. Do you kids know what a Walkman is? Wow. I finally got it together, and my boys helped me up, still laughing. They started running again, and I told her that it was okay, and she insisted on looking at my face. Out of nowhere, I said, "Are you going to the dance on Saturday?" She stopped and stepped back. No, she said. "I wrestle, and I have a meet in the morning, but I'm going," I said. This part I still remember as a 40-something-year-old guy now. My head was ringing, and I know I must have made a complete asshole out of myself. "Oh, okay," she said. "Do you want me to go with you?" I asked. "Yeah, I said that, Mr. Smooth. Let me tell you, I hear about it all the time, and she still says it was the sweetest thing she had ever heard." "Okay," she said again, and then I ran off for another lap without thinking to get her number or make plans or whatever. But thank God I got my head back together, and she was still at her locker on the next pass. She wrote down her number, and I told her to meet me at the front of the building and that I'd look for her. You remember when it was that easy? Just both meet up at the same place and that was it? I didn't see her in school on Friday, and I told the guys what I'd done, and my best friend Sal slapped me on the back and said that it was awesome and that Candy was a total fox. Most of the guys had dates for the dance too, so we figured we'd all hang out together, in typical 80s kid dance. I called Candy that night and we talked for a long time. She was California, and we lived in Massachusetts now, and missed home and hadn't made a lot of friends here yet. She'd only been at our school for a couple of weeks, and I told her I'd introduce her to everybody I knew. The next day at my meet, I was surprised to see her in the stands. Anyway, I won my match and was all set for a nap and the dance. It was super cold out, and everyone was waiting outside of the doors to the school and waiting for them to open. We were just goofing around with the guys. Candy came up, and I introduced her to everybody. We finally got inside, and the guys did their thing, and the girls did theirs. But Candy and I grabbed 2 chairs first, too scared to dance. What kid isn't at that age, right? We were having a good time talking, and then a slow song came on, and I asked her to dance, and we did. And here's where the needle jumps the record. Over her shoulder, I see Tara staring at us, and it's not a good stare. She looks like the devil. She is so pissed. I ignore and think, separation. Fuck her. The song ends and a bunch of girls rush over to Candy and sweep her away into the bathroom. They're all laughing and giggling. They were being wicked nice to her. I mean, everyone was, and I remember how I kept thinking how foxy she really was. Then I got a tap on my shoulder. It was Missy, one of the little crotches from Tara's little clique. Tara wants to know what you're doing?" I burst out laughing. "Having fun. And why isn't Tara asking me what I'm doing?" "You're being a total dick, you know that? She's crying her eyes out over you right now." Oh, for Pete's sake, I thought. I looked for her but couldn't find her, and Missy made some other snippy comment I didn't catch, and I told her to blow me or something like that, and turned away to see Sal's girlfriend Mindy and another buddy's girl Lori running across the gym. "Hurry, Candy's in trouble. Someone just went to get Miss Connors." Miss Connors was a teacher and a chaperone. I ran with the group to the girls' bathroom, and some other girls were pushing Tara out, and there was a whole lot of yelling and screaming going on. Miss Connors showed up with a couple of other teachers and sorted things out. Tara had jumped Candy and tried to smash her head into a mirror in the bathroom, and then pushed her down and started kicking her. The people dragged Tara away, and she was yelling that Candy was dead and yada yada yada. Miss Connors and Mrs. Gillespie brought Candy out of the bathroom, and she was crying and her makeup was all sloppy. She reached out for my hand, and Miss C said she had to get looked at by the nurse. They took her to the office, and a bunch of us waited outside. Tara got kicked out of the dance, and everyone was talking about it, too. Candy came back out. I hugged her and asked if she wanted to go home. She said no, so we stuck around and danced some more. Towards the end, I called my parents and asked if Sal, Mindy, and Candy could come over for a while after the dance, and my mom said yes as long as their parents knew and could pick them up by midnight. After the dance, we walked to my house laughing and put the craziness behind us until a car came up and slowed down next to us. Suddenly, a bunch of eggs came flying at us and the car took off. Thankfully, none of them landed on us, but it sure got us spooked. I chalked it up to high school kids just being dicks. The dance ended at 10, and I only lived like 10 minutes away, so we got there quick, and my dad ordered us pizza. He knew Sal and Mindy, and I was happy introducing Candy to my parents. We were eating and talking when the phone rang, and my mom got it. I heard her say, "I'm sorry, he's with friends right now. Can I have him call you back?" Then she said in a really loud voice, "What did you just say to me?" And then she hung up the phone. She murmured something to my dad, but I didn't catch it. And not long later, the phone rang again, and my dad answered. "I don't know who you think you are, but knock it off. Don't call again." Then he came walking through the dining room into the kitchen to get a beer, and he gave me a look. I followed him and asked what was up, and he told me it was nothing. Another phone call, my mom again on the horn. This time I went into the living room, and the look on her face said it all. She was pissed and flummoxed at the same time. My dad grabbed the phone out of her hand, saw me, and pointed for me to leave, and then dialed what I found out later was the police. I went back to my friends, and about 15 minutes later we heard pops or something like that coming from the front of our house. Then there was a crash of glass breaking, and my dad yelled out something. We all jumped up and ran into the living room, and my dad was running out onto the porch yelling, "Get the hell out of here!" and "What the hell is wrong with you?" Then we all saw the cop car lights and spotlights were turned on to the snow in our front yard. Tara and her mom were in my front yard and had thrown toilet paper in our bushes and were now throwing eggs at our house. One had hit a window and broken it. Hard to believe who was throwing eggs from the car earlier. I'm surprised I didn't recognize it as Tara's mom's car. Anyway, the two psychos were stuck between my dad and the cops and were caught egg-handed. Tara and my mom were put into a car while my dad talked to the officers, and then they also asked me what I knew, and I told them about the separation thing. The cop, I can't remember his name, just laughed and shook his head. By now, my mom had called my friends' parents, and they were all coming to get their kids. I had a quick makeout session with Candy and asked her to be my girlfriend, and she said yes. This is our favorite story, as the only time we quote-unquote were separated was during college, and we did get married afterwards. Outside of me smashing my face in her locker door, this is her go-to story with our kids, telling them that their daddy was into bad girls until I met her. As for Tara and her mom got arrested for being wasted, and I mean wasted that night, and she had encouraged Tara to get into this mischief. It was all her idea. They moved away, and I never heard from Tara again. I know the story isn't super scary, but it was crazy for this to happen to kids. I mean, what kind of mother does shit like that? I can't imagine what Tara's like now if she's anything like her crazy mother. Peas in a pod, I guess. Inside the Stadium. Submitted by Tai Yuk. About 10 years ago, a friend we met here in Asia had been visiting and living in Indonesia. He has a very different constitution than the average man and talks in a very matter-of-fact kind of way. He told us all kinds of amazing stories about life in Indonesia, and one in particular about a place where he had seen reptilian beings on more than one occasion. The place where they were seen was at a nightclub in Jakarta called the Stadium, which may seem ludicrous until you understand what kind of place it was. It was a place of low vibration where people pursue their carnal lusts. Women are sold into prostitution, and ecstasy was sold in the open on silver trays by the staff. The place was done in a reptilian motif with all kinds of Illuminati symbolism, such as the eternal flame, like the one the Statue of Liberty holds in New York Harbor, or the Monas Tower in Jakarta. The railing of the different levels that overlooked the dance floor was all cobra heads with their hoods spread, and a huge winged dragon suspended over the stage and sound system with a humanoid figure sitting mounted on its neck. That figure was holding a scepter. We kind of agreed that it was Isis. On a lower level there was a bar and a stage. On the stage was a large sculpture of a man that looked like the top half of the Oscar award, muscular but with its hands chained together at the wrists as to suggest humanity enslaved. The place was huge, and a lot of money was put into it. Anyway, our friend invited us to visit him in Jakarta, and that we could go and try to see the reptilians if we wished, but there were no guarantees we would see them. They don't always show themselves, or certain conditions must align in order for them to be seen. Our friend said that they were only visible 2 or 3 times out of every 10 times he visited. Yeah, he was a real party hound, and he would go into this place and stay there until Monday morning, thinking it was Sunday, until his employer would call and ask him why he wasn't at work. One of the conditions to see these reptilian beings was that you had to take ecstasy, and I know a lot of people hearing this will say, they were high on drugs. It was all a drug-induced hallucination, case closed. I wish it were that simple. Another way to view it is that the brain is a biological computer that can see and decode a very small range of visible light, and ecstasy brings the brain down to a lower vibration where these things are visible. However, when you figure in the reptilian factor, it explains a lot of things. Like, why does royalty only marry royalty? Why are there dungeons with torture devices under castles? Thousands of people vanish every year around the world. Where do they go? So we went to the stadium on a Saturday night, and the place was in full swing, blaring loud music, and crowds were dancing to the loud pulse of the rave-style tunes. We all took a pill of ecstasy and began drinking like fish, as the alcohol really didn't seem to faze us. I think there was methamphetamine in there as well. I don't enjoy these damn pills at all, but in order to view these creatures it must be done, and as I said, our host has a different constitution. There were 3 in our group, and we would wander around drinking beer and exploring the different levels of the club going our own way, and then meet up with each other again here and there at random. One of our party had made friends with a Canadian guy who was also on E, and would also be in for the surprise of his life. Several hours passed uneventfully, and I had bumped into our host again, and we were hanging out when the other guy in our party came up to us with a frantic, disconcerted aura about him, and his mouth dropped open in astonishment, to which our host said, "You saw him, didn't you?" The guy just nodded in agreement because he was so stunned he couldn't speak. Our host directed us to the cobra motif railing that overlooked the huge dance floor. We were up on the 3rd floor and had a view of the entire floor that was very crowded, and our host said, "Don't tell us where they are. We will point them out and you will concur if we are right." There were 2 by the DJ booth and 1 out in the crowd, a total of 3. You couldn't see them right off, it depended on the lighting. When they were in the stray ambient light, they appeared human, but as they moved out of the light into shadow, they would shapeshift. Their arms would become very long, and they were about 7 feet tall. When they drifted back into the light, they would appear human again. I don't know how to explain it really, but it's mind-blowing to say the least to encounter pure evil and mass manipulators of humanity that have caused unspeakable horror and suffering throughout the ages. Terror is their candy. They get excited around it, like a python in a cage with a rabbit. It shook our one friend up quite a bit, as he did not believe in anything paranormal, and really shook his belief system so bad that shortly afterwards he just got on a plane and went back to Canada. I mean, with only the shirt on his back. He abandoned everything in his apartment and went back to his mother's house. It shook him up pretty bad, to say the least. I was shook up too, but not near as bad as him because I knew such things existed. I've had my own paranormal experiences, but to the unbeliever it can cause a great shock because everything they thought was true is nonsense now. The "this can't be happening" is the door to fear. However, he did fully recover and has returned to Asia. Now, I can tell my paranormal stories and theories are not to be scoffed at or be dismissed without examination. I've heard the stadium has since closed down. It wasn't really smiled upon because of the drugs and depravity that goes on there, and God knows what else. But I always suspected horrible things went on in that basement, such as human sacrifice and or torture, knowing the nature of reptilians. The stadium was closed down after some rich kid, lit on drugs and drunk on alcohol, sped down a street one morning and plowed into a crowd of vendors, killing about 8 people. That's okay, though. We don't miss that place at all. And last I heard, the reptilians weren't showing themselves for whatever reason. These beings are a scourge on humanity and have kept us ignorant in order to exploit us. They are highly intelligent and master manipulators, and know the best way to keep slaves is to keep them thinking they are free and in control. And this eliminates the threat of revolt. The reptilians are everywhere, in education, science, and oh yes, religion. Was I marked for death? Submitted by King Dave. When I was about 12 years old, I met this guy. He was about 20. I'll clarify that I'm a guy, and no, he wasn't some creepy dude that liked hanging out with 12-year-old boys. He was just a good dude. He and his family quickly became good friends of our family. He had 3 little brothers, and they were 5, 8, and 10, and he lived with his mom and stepdad. His mom was a real piece of work, just batshit crazy, and they had a crazy relationship. For instance, on his 21st birthday, she hit him with a broomstick and broke his arm. Anyway, they had all moved here from Arizona, and when we met, he became my best friend, like an older brother, and honestly, a better one than my own brother was. One day after we had known each other for a couple of years, and he was now 22 and I was 14, his mother decided they were moving back to Arizona. So they packed up all their shit and took off, leaving him behind to finish cleaning up the house and collecting the deposit from the landlord, stuff like that. About 2 weeks later, she came back to get him, and he didn't want to leave because he and my family and my other best friend had become really close. But he couldn't break away from her psycho grip. It was July 4th, and he was house-sitting for the day for another friend of ours, a really crazy kind of weird guy, but still a good guy too. My mom and I had gone over to bring him some barbecue for dinner, and we were all sitting around smoking a joint when he started talking strange. At first, he told me that he loved me like a brother, and I said, "Thanks, bro, I feel the same." Then he told me he was afraid to die alone, and he asked me if I would take care of his dog when he was gone. I said, "Sure, no problem." And then he went into his wallet and pulled out about $120 and gave it to me and said he didn't need it anymore. I told him I'd hold on to it, and none of this seemed strange at the time. I was sitting on the couch with my mom sitting next to me, and my friend Mike was sitting on the floor against the couch on the other side than my mom. It was dark in the house and real quiet, when all of a sudden I heard a click-clack pretty loud. I looked in the opposite direction from where my friend was because the sound echoed, and I heard my mom yell, "Mike, no!" And I looked over, and he had my friend's Colt 45 to his head. He had taken it out from under the cushion I was sitting on without me noticing, and I grabbed him with one hand on the gun and the other clenched on his shirt, and we scuffled for a second. He managed to jerk the gun away from my hand, and as I went to grab it again, I almost went deaf from the shot and felt the warmth of the blood and gray matter that splattered on my face. He had shot himself, and as he slumped over in my lap, I was trying to put pressure on the wound to control the bleeding. The exit wound from the 45 hollow point was bigger than my palm, and at the same time I was trying to cover the entry wound as my mom called 911. They asked her where the gun was, and it was still in his hand. The 911 operator said to take the gun from him in case he was conscious enough to shoot himself again or one of us. But I wasn't worried about the gun. I was trying to save my friend. The cops and ambulance showed up and took over, and I was covered in blood, brain matter with chunks of bone in my hair and clothes. The paramedics rolled him over and had to pry the gun from his hand. They call it the death grip. It's a result of sudden brain trauma. The police took our report and sent us home, and Mike didn't make it. The next day his mom showed up and asked me where Mike was, and I had to tell her what happened. She was very calm as she told me that she didn't believe he would do that. Hell, I didn't believe he would do it. But then she proceeded to tell me she believed that I had killed him. She had him cremated and took his ashes and went back to Arizona. And I wish I could say that this was the end of the story, but I've never had that luck. A few days after she left, a detective came to my house. Yeah, that bitch put me under investigation for murder. After about 3 hours of the worst kind of questions you could ask about this shit, my mom told them that that was enough and they left. Well, remember when 911 said to take the gun away? Well, it's a good thing I didn't, because that's what ultimately saved my ass. They said the only way for him to have a grip on the gun like that was for him to be holding it when he was shot. To them, it was an open and shut suicide. A few weeks later, my mom got a letter in the mail. It was from Mike's mom, and she said that we would pay for what we had done to her family, and that my mom would know how it felt to lose her son. Again, I wish I could say that was the end. About 8 months later, I was at a friend's house, and he introduced me to his cousin who grew up a few towns over. He asked me if we had ever met, and that I looked really familiar. We hadn't, but he was really tripping on how much he felt that he had seen me before. Anyway, I'd started telling my friend about what had happened to Mike that night, and the cousin got really excited and a little freaked out, as he told me now he remembered why he thought he knew me. He had seen a picture of me, and then he said Mike's mom's name and his name. Apparently, he was in a dope dealer's house, and the lady gave those two guys a photo of me and $10,000 to kill me. I wouldn't have believed him, but he knew things he couldn't possibly have known, and I got real paranoid after that and felt the need to carry a gun everywhere I went. The police said there was nothing they could do, and nothing ever happened. I figured the guys just took her money and that was it, but I still worry about it from time to time. Like I said, he had 3 little brothers that were raised to believe I murdered their older brother, so who knows if they want revenge or if they will come looking for me. I'm 37 now, and I still live in the same town and only a couple of miles from where it happened. I don't do social media, and I keep to myself a lot. I always have to know where my wife and kids are and keep security tight at my home. Anyway, that's my story, not ghostly, but it's all true. A Monster in Georgia by Anonymous. This occurred in an area that is flanked to the north by a swamp marsh waterway, and to the north as well there are farmlands with cattle. Just southwest there are a series of creeks and waterways that lead into the woodlines behind a couple of small farms, one of which has horses on it. This incident took place in the woods just behind and around my home. The land has a natural series of creek beds, and it grows very thick in the summer. It's also heavily wooded with many low areas at the back of the 4 acres that I live on. 1 acre is fenced in and clear cut, the rest is natural growth. The area, although being developed for housing, is still seated in a lot of heavy wooded terrain. I have lived on this land for a decade, and I've always kept dogs in a fenced-in yard that borders the wooded area of the property. At just after 1:30 in the morning one night, I woke up to my dogs barking in a very aggressive manner. I got out of bed to go and shut them up, thinking that it was just likely a dog or a deer that was wandering through the woods at night. It was nearly a full moon, and I should add here that in my 10 years that I've lived there, I have never seen a human in the woods behind my house. I stepped out onto the back porch in my underwear and yelled at the dogs. And this is where it got very different from all the countless times I'd quieted them in the past. I yelled out, "All right, y'all chill out! People are sleeping!" And before I finished the sentence, I heard footsteps, not of a 4-legged variety, but one very methodically going after the other. This got my full attention. I have a storage building at the back corner of my yard, and my first thought was that somebody must be trying to break into it. It sits on the very back corner of the fence and could be accessed by hopping over a 4-foot chain link fence. I went back inside to grab a flashlight and my 9mm pistol, but as I went back inside, I heard a sort of shriek coming from outside. It was very loud and actually made me jump a bit. I was thinking it was likely teenagers at this point, likely shouting some sort of insult, but there was something unnerving about the way it carried into my house. I told my girlfriend, who was starting to wake up, that there was somebody walking in the woods making weird noises, and that she needed to come hear it for herself, and I was going to chase him off. I ran back out onto the porch and shouted, "Whoever you are, I'm going to let these dogs out, so you better speak and be on your way." No response came back, but the footfalls were obviously close to the fence line and were heavy sounding. I went over to the gate, and the dogs would not leave the yard or my side. This was the first time that I had ever witnessed them refuse a chance to run into the woods, and at this point, I was a bit angry and embarrassed that I had made a threat to the intruder, and that my dogs just sat there. This was when my whole world was tilted on its ear. I shouted, "I'm about to come out there and find you, and when I do, I'm going to shoot you." figuring this would make whoever it was haul their ass out of there. As I yelled this thing went from one end of my yard, around the corner of the fence, to up near the front of my yard in less than 15 seconds, with a very distinct two-legged sound, loud and heavy. In broad daylight, I could not duplicate this speed in twice the time. There are obstacles everywhere that you will bust your butt on out there. I had no intention of going into the woods in my underwear and barefoot, so I chambered around and fired a couple of shots into the ground, with the fourth being a misfire that I quickly cleared. At that moment, something started shrieking and howling at extremely high decibels and was coming closer. It wasn't running away, but running towards the side of the front of my house where I was standing. My girlfriend was up on the side porch and asking, "What the hell is that?" And then, even though I was between her and the woods, she said she was going back inside. Normally when an animal is in the woods, I can trick it into looking into a flashlight by making a high-pitched noise or whistle, thereby giving me a look at its position. This time, the thing never revealed its eyes to me, and I found that to be very unusual. I have to add here that I was physically shaking at how much noise this thing made and how heavy it sounded as it kept howling and wailing and screaming and moving around in the tree line just beside my fence. I'm 6'4", 290, and I'm not fat. My friends often joke that I'm a shaved Sasquatch. I'm 41 years old and have worked as a bouncer and babysitter in bars from the nicest type, all the way down to the nudie bar hellholes. I am not an easy man to intimidate. Whatever was moving out there was much bigger than me, as well as much faster. I moved up onto the side porch to be ready to flee from whatever the hell it was, and I would be lying if I said otherwise here. I was badly shaken by this thing. Being unable to see it while it was so close was chilling my blood. When I got to the porch and up the stairs, both porches are about 5 feet above the ground, this thing moved back into the woods, like a couple of 100 feet. How do I know this? I heard it as it went, one step after another. And me and my girlfriend, who was standing just inside the side porch door, heard what seemed to be heavy timber being smacked or knocked together. It came in a succession of 3 whumps each time, which really unnerved me as I had just fired 3 rounds. Coincident or not, it was like it was letting me know it was aware of what I just did and was replicating the 3 knock slams each time, and then would pause a few seconds before doing it again. It stopped doing this and I shouted out again, this time saying something to the effect of, "Who are you?" And then I heard it moving back this way again. It moved so fast that it actually defied anything logical. The very heavy and rhythmic sound of one foot after another was so audible. I was only shouting at this point because in the back of my mind I wanted to hear a human voice or laughter from kids, anything but another god-awful howl. I was hoping for a known explanation or a reason for the sounds to be as loud as they were, like maybe a recording played through a bullhorn or something. But I knew that this was something very different. My mind was refusing to believe that this was real, yet there I was hearing it for myself. At this point, my girlfriend was pleading for me to come back inside so she could lock the doors. I went inside and put on some pants and shoes, dug out a video camera, and turned off all the lights on the back part of the house. I wish I had taken it out the first time, but I believe that it was a prowler or vandal at first, so there was no reason to take a camera. The gun and flashlight are my 2 best bets in that case. But I truly regret not having it with me when this thing started making those sounds. I crept down the stairs to the yard in the darkness, and I sat there for a while, and then decided to move over toward the fence line by the side porch. Just then, from the woods, there came those damned footfalls again. I was in the dark, and I had a flashlight too, but I didn't want to reveal my position. This thing was shadowing my movements from the left to the right of the yard, staying in equal distance outside the fence. I did this for over an hour, with it moving every single time I did. I would remain stationary for 5 or 10 minutes at a time, and at one point I thought I heard my dogs down in my storage shed. I figured they went in there to bed down, and I walked back to my stairs to go inside, and my blood ran cold when I realized that both dogs were cowering in my living room. I had not pulled the door closed behind me when I went inside, and they had to be physically removed from the house to the back porch. That has also never happened with them before. At this point, I actually went into my workroom and grabbed a thick piece of wood and cut it to bar the back door from sliding open. In the decade I've lived out here, I've never had a lock on my back door, due to the fact that there were always dogs in the yard who hate everything that is not me or my family. Nobody goes in the backyard. I thought about calling the sheriff's department at this point, but what could I tell them? I'm afraid a Bigfoot is pissed at me and it's after me? Yeah, I don't think so. That just sounds way too damn crazy. That all happened the first night. The next day, I was mad that I was so afraid the night before. I had 2 rechargeable spotlights, but neither one was working that night. The bulbs or batteries were bad. Who knows? I went to Home Depot and bought a 2.25 million candle power spotlight and took it home. I've hunted all my life, so I thought I would rig up some light along my fence line near the shed. And if this thing came back, I could flip a switch and turn night into day, and maybe get a look at it as it fled the light and went to the same dark corner of my lot. At that point, I figured I could light it up with the 2.25 million candle power light. My girlfriend walked to the shed with me, and I went to the fence to position the light. As I got to the fence, I was talking to her saying, if I put it here, it should run back to the other side. And there it was. I saw it with my own eyes, between 2 trees and some brush. There was a 3 by 3 foot section of long brown fur, clearly visible and moving slightly. I yelled, "There it is!" And although my girlfriend thought I was kidding, she saw the bushes as they were being parted as something moved rapidly into the more dense growth. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a dog. It was too massive. I saw the rounded back of the animal as it sort of duck-walked away towards a creek bed, and it was gone in a matter of seconds, and I was not going to chase it. We were standing there in total disbelief. The damn thing was still here the next day in broad daylight. It just seemed too surreal to believe. Was it waiting for me? We waited for a while and never heard anything move. It was in there and it was trying to hide. We walked around to the front part of the shed, and that's when we noticed 2 odd things. One was that there was black water bubbling up from the ground, and it had a very strong smell to it. This is on the other side of the yard from where my septic lines should be, as well as uphill from them. I was wondering if the smell maybe drew this thing in close to my home. Secondly was the spookiest of all. There was a footprint in my yard that measured 15 inches in length, right by my fence, where it seemed like this thing stepped over it into the woods. This was in the soggy part near the black water, and I tried to replicate it myself with my size 14s, but the difference was still huge. It seemed to have a rounded heel and toes, and I don't know if the plaster will set there due to this new mystery spring that has crept up, but I covered it with a paint roller tray to protect it from the dogs walking on it anyway. I didn't figure how it could be anybody but me in this yard, and once again, I couldn't duplicate it. I hope there was an explanation for this other than a friggin' Sasquatch in my yard. There's also a broken branch in my yard at the 10 to 12 foot height on a fresh limb that we just noticed. The thought of it coming over the fence into my safe zone is a little more than I want to believe right now. I went exploring the woods today with a friend who told me that he has read sometimes sticks or big limbs will be stacked in a triangle or pyramid fashion when Bigfoot are around. We found at least 7 such things back in that area along and around the creek bed, some of which were from a species of tree that is nowhere near my neighborhood. These structures don't seem to be anything that would naturally happen if a tree or other branches just fell. I don't know if these are significant or not, but I also found a 5-inch diameter tree that was knocked down with all the roots intact and not enough vegetation on it to account for the wind having done it. This was just on the other side of my fence, right behind my shed. I know something's out there, and I'm going to be vigilant and hope it comes back, but at the same time, I am afraid if it will. More Than She Said, submitted by Gregonator. This happened in the summer of 1988. The names had been changed, etc., etc. I was 17 at the time and working at a local grocery store to make some money, as I was planning on going to college after I graduated. I had a car, but was so cheap at the time, I rarely drove it to save on gas. I wanted to have extra cash at school and live like the life I saw in the movies. Yeah, that was a bunch of bullshit and not how college life really is, but that's another story. So my family was having a party that night for the people who lived around us and our extended family, too. We lived in the country in Kansas, and the closest town was about 3 miles away. I rode my bike back and forth there all year long after school and practice and on weekends to work, and this weekend was no exception. I was excited to see some of my cousins and my friends, so I was pedaling hard home from work, and I popped a tire. Like the moron that I was, I didn't have a pump and patch kit with me, so I had no other choice but to hoof it the rest of the way, pushing my bike. Not long after, a pickup truck pulled up, and a woman in her 20s shouted out if I needed a ride. I said yeah, and she said put the bike in the bed of the truck. This was the 80s, guys, and out in the middle of nowhere, we didn't think about stranger danger and all that stuff. I hopped in the truck and said thanks, and the woman said no problem, where are you headed? I told her I was just going up the road, and she said, you got a name? I told her it was Greg, and she said her name was Shayna. I thought that was an odd name. I didn't know anyone with a name like that. She didn't look like she was from around there either. She wore skin-tight jeans and a tight top, where most of the girls at this time around me were into baggier jeans and looser shirts. Shayna looked like she was from the city. She drove to my house, and when she pulled down the long driveway up to it, my mom and aunt came out to see who the stranger in the truck was. Our closest neighbors were about 1.5 miles away, and we all kind of knew who drove what and that sort of thing. Just typical country folk. I jumped out and got my bike, and before I could thank her, my mom was in her cab window saying hi and looking over at me. Over my shoulder I said, "This is Shayna, Mom. She gave me a ride home. My bike's got a flat." My mom and aunt broke into smiles and thanked her for being so kind, and then asked her where she was from. Shayna said she was just driving through and got lost, and was on her way to see her grandparents that lived in a town about 20 miles from ours. "Oh, well," said my mom, "why don't you stick around and join us for some food before you head back out? We're having a grand party today, and you can't say no." My mom is great, and I love her, but I always thought that was so lame, calling things grand all the time. Grand party, grand reunion, grand everything she did. Shayna hesitated for a minute, but then said, "Sure, why not?" She pulled her truck around in our drive, and I ran in to get cleaned up, and the party was in about an hour, and people were just starting to arrive. When I came back out, Shayna was helping my aunt with stuff, and my cousins had just arrived, so I wasn't paying too much attention to her, and she kind of began to blend in. About 40 people showed up, and while some of us were playing games and Shayna was milling around the adults, she finally saw me and came over. We talked for a while, but she was just really quiet about where she was from and kept everything really vague, like she was from out of state and didn't talk about her family, except her grandparents. My cousin Luke asked her about them, and she repeated the same story she told my parents, and he pressed her on some names, and I think she gave a really generic name like Jones or Smith. That part's kind of fuzzy in my recollections. Luke gave her a look, but didn't say anything, and then he shot me a look, and again, didn't say anything. After a bit, we went to get food, and my uncle, who I need to say is a cop, said hi to us as we sat eating chicken and corn on the cob. He asked Shayna more questions, and again she was really evasive, and I could tell my uncle wasn't buying any word of what she said. I was starting to wonder why everyone was so interested in this normal girl who just gave me a ride home. We ate, and Shayna said she had to go, but needed to use the bathroom, and could I show it to her. I let her into the house, and then went to my room to get something I had borrowed from another cousin, and Shayna came into my room while I was rooting around for it, and she said she had to get going. "You're a cute kid, you know that?" she said, and I probably blushed. I walked her to the door and thanked her again, and she thanked me. She got into her truck, but not before kissing me and saying, "See you around." I watched her drive off and then went back to the party. My uncle caught me before I got into a game of football and asked me more about Shayna. There wasn't much to tell. She told me the same stuff. He looked at me hard, and then he got me in a headlock and called me Greginator, his nickname for me after I accidentally set the grass next to our house on fire once. I laughed, but again was wondering if something was up. Everyone stayed into the evening, and we had a bonfire and just kept the party going. A few of us teens sneaked a few beers and talked around the fire as the adults moved into the house. And Luke also asked me more about Shayna, but stopped after a while and just said, "Damn though, man, she was hot. She looks like the woman from the When It's Love Van Halen video." And I thought about it and had to agree. Everything wrapped up after midnight, and I'm sorry for such a long backstory, but this is when things got crazy. About 1:30, I was still up, laying in bed and listening to some music, when I heard a tapping at my window. I went over to it, and it was Shayna. I pushed up the screen and half pulled her in, telling her to be quiet so as not to wake my parents. "What are you doing here?" I whispered. She just smiled and said she couldn't get me out of her mind and wanted to talk. We sat down on my bed, and I asked her why she wasn't at her grandparents', and she said she got bored because they went to bed so early. Before I knew it, we were making out, and I thought I was about to get laid by this pretty but mystery girl. So now we're laying under the sheets, and I'm a 17-year-old horn dog going for it, when I hear a bunch of noise from outside. I started to get up, and Shayna pulled me back and wrapped her legs around me after spooning me. I heard someone ring the doorbell, and my dad thumping down the hallway to see who it was, and I could hear him talking loudly with someone but not being able to make out exactly what. Shayna scrunched down and grabbed what was between my legs and held on, whispering, "Don't let them find me here." Alright, I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but suddenly I got a weird feeling something was up. I felt her press her other hand into my back with her knuckles, and I pushed back slightly. More footsteps came down the hallway, and my door suddenly opened. I faked like I was asleep, and I heard my dad say, "See, he's right there, asleep." And then he closed the door. I whispered to Shayna again, "What's going on? Who's looking for you?" She just stuck her tongue in my ear and told me she was going to give me something I wouldn't forget. I tried to roll over, but her grip on my Johnson was strong, so I couldn't. There was more banging and thumping and loud voices from down the hall, and I heard my uncle say, "Rick," my dad's name is Rick, "her truck is a mile up the road. She's got to be here somewhere." I heard more noise as footsteps went from room to room and into the basement, and then I heard the ladder to our roof crawl space come down. That's when we both heard a crack of a stick outside my bedroom window, and a flashlight fall on us and a voice yell out, "She's in there with Greg." Footsteps came running back to my room, and Shayna gripped me so hard I yelled out, and she said to shut up. My door flew open, and there was my uncle and two other deputies right behind him with guns drawn but pointed at the floor. My mom was screaming something awful somewhere in the background as my uncle told me to take it easy, and then told Shayna to let me get out of bed. She didn't and held me closer to her, shouting to leave us alone. There was a back and forth for a few minutes, with me trying to talk and Shayna shouting over me every time I tried to. Finally, she realized she wasn't going anywhere, and she let me go, and I rolled onto the floor looking like a complete idiot, hard on and all, still raging. It went away when I looked up at Shayna and saw that it wasn't her knuckles she was pressing into my back as she held me. It was a gun. The deputies pounced on her and got her to her feet and out through the house and into a cruiser. They took her away, and my uncle stayed around to talk to my parents and asked me a ton of questions. So Shayna was actually named something else and had no family in this state. She was on the run after nearly killing her boyfriend in a fight back in Texas where she was from, and then she stole his truck and had been running for a couple of weeks and screwed up by stopping to help me. There were no grandparents in the town she said they lived in. My uncle had checked and also drove around looking for her truck. Other deputies were doing the same after they had checked on the license plate and found out she was wanted. Other deputies were doing the same thing after everyone had checked on the license plate and found out that it was stolen and she was wanted. My uncle had driven back to our house and saw her truck abandoned on the side of the road, as she was smart enough to know she was being hunted. It came out later that she planned on stealing my dad's vehicle, taking me with her and making a getaway. I know she went back to Texas and was convicted of a bunch of things and went to jail, but I'm sure she's been out for a long time now, and I don't really know the whole story. I did at one point in time, but like I said, things get fuzzy. So, yeah, that happened. An innocent country boy looking for love got caught up with a crazy girl and nearly got himself kidnapped and who knows what else. Moral of the story: if a woman seems too good to be true no matter how old you are, she probably is. Stay safe out there, everyone. My Short Time as an EMT. Submitted by Tanya D. So, I got into an EMS program when I was in high school in my hometown. I was always a tomboy and tended to hang out with guys more than girls, and that's not to say I didn't have a lot of girlfriends, but I just liked the stuff the guys were doing more than cheerleading and stuff like that. Outside of softball, my only big interest was in an explorers club run out of my town's volunteer fire department. I loved my class and thought I'd get my EMT certification as soon as I could, and then work while going to college and figure out if I wanted to pursue a career in it or just be a volunteer after a while. My classes helped out a lot, and I got certified not long after graduation. I started doing ride-alongs with the others at the local ambulance corps to learn as much as I could before fall classes started up. And let me tell you, the things I saw and did, well, you'll see the outcome at the end of this. Let me say right away that I'm not skittish about blood or wounds or anything like that. It was the people I interacted with that got to me, the depravity of some and the hopelessness of others. It was a serious crash course into what the world looks like when things don't go so well. Druggies, homeless people, older people that no one gives a shit about, it all starts to wear on you, and I was only doing this for a couple of weeks. I'd been to a few gunshot wound calls, some basic welfare checks on older folks that had gone silent with their families that weren't living in the area anymore, random first aid stuff and the like. But one night in August left me with a taste that I just couldn't get out of my mouth. It was late on a Wednesday evening, and 3 of us were in a standard transport, gassing up and getting some food while we waited for our next call. I was with 2 guys. Let's say they're Dennis and Mike. We were just talking about baseball and general things, just passing the time. They were both 3 years older than me, but didn't treat me like the 18-year-old that I was, and as far as they were concerned, I was part of the team. It was just before 11 o'clock, and we got a call for a welfare check. It was an older woman whose life alert device went off, and she wasn't responding to the dispatcher. We got geared up, and off we went to the address. And it was out in farm country, and we had the windows down, and I remember thinking that it was such a nice night, and I was hoping that this would be a routine thing and all would be well. We got to the house, and it was set way back from the road on a long dirt driveway that led to what looked like was once a farm. There was a barn not too far from the house, and a bunch of outbuildings that were in various states of disrepair. Dennis drove right up to the front door, and we got our gear and bags and went up to it. Mike knocked, and there was no sound except for what sounded like a radio off somewhere inside. Mike checked the knob, and it turned, and he pushed the door open. A creepy, gross rotting smell came wafting out on us, and I recoiled before getting my act together. Mike went in and reached for a light switch or something, but he couldn't find one, so we all clicked on our mag lights and quickly found the place was a disaster of major proportions. Clearly a hoarder lived here, and the smell was insane. Rotting garbage, feces from what felt like hundreds of animals and humans probably. I mean, just all kinds of awfulness wrapped into a cloud of gross. We stepped forward, playing our lights around at boxes of stuff piled to the ceiling and pools of God knows what on the floor. Everything seemed sticky, if that makes sense, even the air. Each of us kept calling out for anyone that might be there, but there was just the sound of that radio somewhere in the back of the house. Dennis moved forward and opened a door to what was a bedroom, and the smell that came out was nearly overpowering. In the bed was the corpse of an old woman, laying on top of the sheets that were dark brown and crusted with a plastic sheet over her legs and waist that was literally stuck to what looked like multiple wounds that had once seeped out blood and bodily fluids. I mean, it really looked like a second skin. The woman had long been dead, at least a couple of days, and the flies and bugs were everywhere. I backed into the hallway as Dennis confirmed that she was gone. I swear at that moment I heard the radio get louder, and Mike and I looked at each other. In retrospect, the radio didn't get louder, but it did take our attention away from that woman and something else down the hall. We slowly followed the hall down to what we found was an even more disturbing sight. The floor was covered with blood, and there was a body of a 30-something man in the tub, naked, with down-the-street slashes on his wrists, a bottle of vodka at his side, and a shotgun next to him. Most of his head had been blown off, and pieces of skull and brain were stuck to the tile around a large blast hole behind his body. I gagged, and Mike got a closer look, and said that it likely happened a day ago. I nodded, and we heard Dennis calling out for more police and responders, so we went out and told him what we had found back there. As we all stood in the living room, I noticed something sitting on an old table with pictures on it. It was the life alert device that had been triggered that resulted in our call. It was nowhere near the bodies, unless someone had hit it and then run out of the house. I mean, there was no one there. Who the hell fired it? We stood waiting for the rest of the team when we heard a rustling sound in the corner. A box full of who knows what moved, and we all stood with our lights on it. Dennis and I went over to it and slowly pulled it away from the wall, and a little girl of about 8 or so, covered in filth, sat there curled up looking at us. "He hurt Grandma," was all she said, and we got her up and checked her vitals and scoured her for any wounds. She wasn't hurt at all, but it was clear she was a child of massive neglect. She didn't cry, she didn't do anything. We took her outside, and I went out to the truck and grabbed a stuffed animal. We kept a few of them in there for situations like this. We asked her where her mommy was, and she didn't know. And then we asked about her daddy, and all she said was, "Daddy hurt Grandma, and now he's hurt too." I gave her the stuffed bear, and she clung to it and asked if she could keep it. I told her yes, and she had the littlest of smiles on her face. The rest of the night was a lot of interviewing and reporting, and this is what I was able to piece together over the next few weeks. The girl had been kidnapped from her mother, who lived on the other side of the country and who was frantically looking for her. This guy who had the little girl was her father, but he had immediately taken off before she was born, and the mother had little to no information about who he really was or where he was from. It was a one-night stand gone wrong. Later on, the guy tracked the mother down and snatched the girl and brought her to his mother's house. They were there for a few weeks with the grandmother, who was mentally ill and a hoarder. It seemed like she was telling her son that he needed to stop what he was doing as far as what the little girl said, but the father got violently drunk and broke her legs and pelvis with a mattock and then covered her in plastic, all in front of this little kid. After a couple of days, he snapped even further and killed himself, leaving the little girl alone in that shithole with 2 dead bodies. Somehow, she had figured out how to activate the life alert device, but I don't know how. The little girl got reunited with her mother, who turned out to be a good woman. She had just made a terrible mistake a long time ago, and it ended up coming back to haunt her. After all that, I decided I didn't want to be an EMT or a paramedic anymore, and started nursing school. I'm now an RN in an old folks home, and I love what I do. But I'll never forget that house, that scene, and that little girl who had no idea what was going on around her. I know I won't forget, but I hope in time she does. Not Alone in the Woods, submitted by Hunter Snowman. I've been hunting for a long time, since I was a kid with my father, my uncles, and my friends. Going to Uncle Roy's cabin was a big deal when I was in my teens. It meant a guy's weekend, sometimes skipping school for an opener. good food, and maybe a beer or two, as my dad believed in letting me experience things early so I would make better choices later on in life. Uncle Roy's cabin was up in northern Wisconsin, and it was a great place with 2 rooms of bunks and a huge great room with a kitchen, fireplace, comfy old chairs. It was a home away from home for sure. It stayed in our family after Uncle Roy died back in 1998, and we still use it. But there was one trip with my cousin and best friend that almost made up our minds to never go back. It was early fall, and we went up for a weekend to try our luck on the 60-plus acres, and the drive was about an hour from Appleton where we lived. We were all a couple of years out of college, and it was Travis, me, and my cousin George. We left mid-afternoon and got there before 5, and it was already dark. We got our gear inside and turned on the propane, got a fire going, and figured we'd just kick back with a couple of beers, have some chili, and then hit the sack early before we went out in the morning. It was gun season for deer, and we were all hoping to bag at least one. The next morning was crisp, and we ate some oatmeal, took some power bars, and then suited up and started the walks out to the tree stands out on the property. I think a lot of people have a notion that hunting is the most exciting thing in the world, and it can be thrilling, but a lot of the time it's just sitting on your ass waiting. I had brought a portable radio with headphones that I was playing softly, and for some reason it was Coast to Coast with Art Bell. If you don't know what that show is, it's a talk show that talks about ghosts and Bigfoot and stuff like that. It was about 6 a.m. and it was the only thing I could get in reception, so it kind of gave a spooky air to the whole weekend, that's for sure. Anyway, things were pretty quiet for a couple of hours, and the sun was now up higher in the sky, and I was going to give it a couple of more and then take a break and maybe come back out later. After about a half hour, the show had some guy on talking about demons and stuff, and it was really freaking me out. I only had one earpiece in so I could monitor what was going on around me, and then I heard the sound of leaves crunching. I slowly turned a bit to scan around the area and see if I was about to have a little honey coming my way. But I saw it was Travis holding his shotgun in the crook of his arm, and his other hand looked bloody. I got down from my stand and asked him what was up. He had a weird tale. Travis had heard a noise behind him, like something crashing through the brush, and then he heard something like a muffled yell. Thinking it was someone hurt, and maybe one of us, he got down and went in the direction of where he heard the sounds. Seeing some branches swaying back and forth, he called out and walked towards a part of the forest edge that was stacked with trees. He got to the edge, called out again, and then popped down a little path that led deeper into the forest. As he walked between 2 trees, a thick branch came whipping towards him and cracked him square on the hand, and he dropped his shotgun. He said he heard a laugh and steps running away through the forest before he got over the shock and saw his hand was really banged up. I took a peek at it, and it was really swollen. He could move it, so we didn't think it was broken, but he certainly needed to get some ice on it pronto. We tried to get a message to George, but our signal out here was weak on our cell phones, so I figured he'd just head back to the cabin on his own, and we started walking back to it. When we got there, I got some ice, and Travis put it in a towel and wrapped his hand, and we kept talking about what had happened. He kept saying it was like some crank had set him up, and it wasn't normal to have a booby trap out in the middle of nowhere on posted land like that. It was about another hour when we heard footsteps coming towards the cabin on the gravel, and in came Georgie with a rapidly bruising eye and scratches on his forehead. We immediately asked what the heck had happened to him, and he said something similar to what Travis had said. He'd heard a strange sound in the woods, and when he went to check it out, his foot snagged on something, and the next thing he knew, a thick branch swung down onto the trail and caught him in the temple and face. He wasn't bleeding badly, but I got him some ice too. I said out loud that we should talk to the authorities, as it seemed like someone who was not supposed to be out there was making little traps for us to come across. I volunteered to go the next morning, and I said we should lay low for the rest of the night. At about 2 a.m, we started to hear thumping on the roof, and soon figured out someone was throwing rocks at the cabin. Nothing at the windows, just up on the roof. Everyone was awake at this point, and I told Travis to get his shotgun and go to the back door. I would go to the front door, and on the count of 3, we would open the doors and fire off 2 shells into the air to scare away anyone who was out there. We got ready, and on 3, blam, 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 4 shots almost in perfect unison. Then everything was quiet. We stayed up a bit longer, but nothing happened, so we finally fell back to sleep. I got up early and made the journey to the nearest town where there was a substation and told the deputy everything that had been going on. He said he had a little time to follow me out to our place and have a look around with us. When we made our way up the driveway to the cabin, I noticed that on the outside wall someone had written the words "Go away" in charcoal. The deputy asked if I knew what that was about, and I hadn't even noticed it before. I brought him inside, introduced George and Travis, and we all had a cup of coffee before we set out for our stands and some of the trails we frequently went down while we were hunting. It was an interesting and terrifying walk, as not only the deputy, but all three of us found some pretty creepy things out there. On one thin path between trees and a drop-off of about 15 feet down to a creek, the deputy noticed that someone had set up another trip line close to the ground that could have resulted in a dangerous fall for someone. Near the tree stand George was in, there was something really disturbing. This stand didn't have a ladder, and you used foot pegs and a belt to get up into it. It stayed there all year long. Usually, anyone who was using this stand would just jump down as it was only about 8 or 10 feet up. Good thing George hadn't, because someone had dug a pit about 3 feet deep and put sharpened sticks at the bottom of it, covered it up with light branches and a thin layer of sod. You could stand on it, but a jump down would have surely meant impalement. The deputy was taking pictures of everything and also taking notes in his little pad. There were more booby traps all around the land, at least the portion we frequented. The craziest one? Near a stand my dad used a lot. At the base, there were a number of small holes. In the holes pointed upward were shotgun shells, slugs. On each shell was glued a BB on the primer, and there was a flat stone underneath each one. In essence, if someone stepped on one hard enough or jumped down from the stand, yeah, think about that. Boom. We went back to the cabin, and the deputy radioed for more help, and for the rest of the weekend there were stadies and deputies going all over the land to see what else might be out there. They finally came across a tent in a growth of trees. Inside was a mishmash of dirty clothes, empty food cans and wrappers, a handwritten notebook about how to make traps and bombs, as well as some glass jars that the deputy later proved to be improvised bombs that had to be destroyed by a bomb expert. There were also a bunch of handmade signs that said things like, "Meat is murder," and "How do you like being hunted?" and "Get out or else." Some of these were hanging from trees in our places on the land, and we had not noticed them. They never found anyone, and this is the only time something like this happened out there. The deputies thought it must have been an earth lover that got a little misguided. Yeah, I guess that's one way to put it. We've been back lots of times, and we've all gotten our share of deer and turkey and boar, but thankfully whoever was out there doing all that stuff to scare us off never came back. If that guy by chance hears this, dude, there are other ways to talk to us about your views that don't involve trying to kill us. I'm still shaking my head over that weekend. A police story, submitted by Anonymous. I was a reserve police officer in the United States while I worked my way through academy. I'd been on reserve for about 6 months, and sometimes with the things I saw, it made me question rather whether I wanted to be an officer full-time or not. As an officer, you only get to meet people when something has really gone wrong and they need you there. Before these events, I never even considered the situation in which police were the actual problem in the situation, though. The following took place over a 2-year span, but it remains to this day the sole reason I never became an officer full-time, as well as the reason I trust nobody outside of my wife and kids. And when I say nobody, I mean nobody. It was 1996, and I was about 3 hours from finishing up my hour requirements for the month. That meant the rest of the month I could concentrate on my full-time employment or side security work for extra cash. To say I was excited would probably be an understatement. I loved being a reserve and feeling like I was doing what I could to help people, but it is very, very stressful. Late into my shift, a call came into 911 with a mother screaming saying someone had broken into their home and stabbed her and her kids. The ride there, I hoped it was just a mother overreacting, but when we arrived on scene, it was far worse than I could have ever imagined it would be. One baby was already deceased, and the other was not looking good at all. Paramedics and other police had arrived before we did, and already were working the scene. As soon as I walked in, I had to turn right back around and walk back out. I've seen bad things in my life, but never like this. This was worse than most career police officers ever have to see. I was tasked with my partner to go door to door interviewing neighbors for potential witnesses. We'd been to about 8 houses so far, and out of those 3 reported seeing a black sedan in the area for the last week or so, watching different homes. When our commanding officer came over and told us to stop talking to residents, I was confused and asked, "We haven't even been to a quarter of the neighborhood yet. How can we possibly give you a report on something we haven't finished?" The CO called my partner aside and talked to him for a minute, and when he returned, he just told me that there was no use getting any more info because they had already made a determination on what had happened, and the info was a moot point by now. I just followed his lead, and we went back to the scene, and he took me back home and dropped me off. My time for the month was over, and he had another probie that he was picking up at the station to train. As I was getting out of the car, he told me, "I've seen this before. You can save yourself a lot of regret and questioning yourself by not paying attention to what happens in this case." Even though I didn't understand at the time, I tried to follow what he said, but the case obviously dominated the news, TV, and papers both. So it was very hard not to watch what was going on when it dominated everything else media-wise. Just to keep a long story short, the mother was convicted of the 2 murders. She had her throat cut and missed her carotid artery by less than 2 millimeters, and in the doctor's opinion that was only missed because she was wearing a necklace and it was caught in the wound. The necklace had to be surgically removed from her neck. After everything was said and done, the mother being on the phone with 911 for as long as she was, and the first responder arriving when they did, the timeline went like this. The mother had 2 minutes and 15 seconds to run around the house, cut the screen on the window with a knife, run back inside, kill both her 2 babies, cut her throat, stab her arms, beat herself to a black and blue pulp, wake her husband up, and run 3 blocks and drop a piece of evidence that was found without her leaving a trail of blood. 3 different doctors said that the youngest boy would have passed away from his wounds within 9 minutes. And that's where the timeline comes from with the 911 call and the first officer arriving. They said that her motive was money, but life insurance only paid out $10,000, and the 2 funerals were a little over $14,000. It never made sense to me that if she was the one who did it, then why not wait until after the babies had died to call 911, instead of calling while one of them was still alive? I didn't cover all the facts of the case here, but there was blood-soaked clothing thrown in bags with other blood-soaked clothing, items that were turned over at the scene before they were photographed. The bottom line to me, anyway, this was the worst railroad job I had ever seen against someone, and the mother is still on death row today. Uncle Josh note: the author of this story did share with me some more details and the name of the person in this case. It is real, and this person is on death row. I've been asked to not share any of the names, and I'm going to honor that and respect it. Road Rage, submitted by Justin W. Back in 2012 Labor Day weekend, me and my wife and son took a trip to an amusement park. Living in rural Kentucky, the trip would take us at least 4 to 5 hours as it was in Ohio. We spent the weekend deciding to travel back Sunday midday. We also decided to stop at an exit that was about an hour or so from home, and the gas was cheaper than home prices were, and we all needed snacks and to stretch. It was near dusk and we pulled out. Heading home now, leaving this exit, we would get on the parkway, and the parkway is 2 lanes coming and going, linking rural cities to the city parts. Half exhausted and ready to go home, I kind of started dozing off when I noticed a beetle bug car pass us. I half-heartedly tapped my wife on the shoulder and say, "Punch buggy." Now on the parkway we noticed it was dead, and nothing coming and nothing going, which is the only time I've ever seen it so dead. Someone got behind us as I was dozing, and I heard the wife say, "What the fuck? Why is he riding my ass?" I looked back and noticed that he was tailgating us. She said, "I'm going to tap my brakes so he'll quit." He backed off and we thought, cool, that's over with. And then he bright lights us and is on our ass again within minutes. When I say on our ass, his brights have our RAV4 lit up like a living room. So we drove like this for 5 minutes, and then he went to pass us. He rolled past, and we think, what the fuck is this guy's problem, as he sped off ahead? We were kind of thinking, glad that's over again, and I reached down for a smoke when I heard my wife say, "Holy shit!" as she swerved, and this asshole had pulled his truck long ways across both lanes with his lights off. My wife barely missed him, and he was running toward our car with what seemed to be a gun. Well, at the amusement park, our cell phones were both dead, and we left the charger at the motel. So she was panicking, and I know I have to keep her somewhat calmed down, and I told her to drive fast and to put distance between us, and she did. I forgot to add this guy was in a dually work truck, diesel. You would think it wouldn't haul ass. Well, you're wrong. He gained on us quickly, and before long he was on our ass again, this time almost ramming us. He went to pass us but stayed right alongside of us and looked in the back seat and saw our boy asleep in the car seat. He made eye contact with me and gave me the slitting the throat motion. I flipped him off. Fucking toothless hillbilly. He sped past us, then got in front of us and e-braked. His truck broke so hard that I thought the ass end was going to fall out. Sparks were shooting everywhere. My wife dodged him again, and now we were only about 20 miles from our exit. I told the wife, fucking floor it, or he's going to run us off the road, or start shooting. She was up to 90, and literally we hadn't seen one other car coming or going. Well, sure enough, he's starting to make ground on us again when I noticed our exit was only 5 miles away. I told her to kill the lights. Our exit had a rest area right off the ramp. I figured we could pull in there and duck behind some cars and wait it out. It was a full moon, and she killed the lights as we ducked into the rest area. He got off on the exit as well, but by this time we were parked behind a rig, and we saw him roll by the rest area. We waited another 20 minutes there gathering our thoughts and just thinking, what the fuck? Finally we pulled out and drove past some novelty shops and through a resort town before getting to our hometown on a 2-lane road. As we were going through that stretch, my wife yelled out, "Holy shit!" He was coming straight for us with his lights off. I knew that we were either going to die or wreck right into him. My wife must have had an adrenaline surge because she hammered the gas down heading right at him, and at the last minute he took the ditch. My wife was now sobbing, and I pulled out my phone and prayed to God, please just let it come on. The power of prayer works, because I had 3%, and I called 911 and we told them what was going on. They told us we were too far out for a trooper to get us, but that they would notify our local police and they would meet us at the county line. Sure enough, that bastard got behind us once again, and my wife started crying, and the dispatcher heard her and told her to calm down and that the police were en route. My wife said she knew a turnoff spot up ahead, and she was going to pull in there and kill the lights. She did, and he rolled past. We waited and pulled out, but the fucker had waited on the road for us. At this point, we were 3 miles from our county line, and he was on us again. Suddenly, we saw blue lights everywhere coming towards us and behind us. They got him pulled over, and we pulled over just ahead of him. And the guy had gotten out and was approaching our car with a gun drawn, and we heard, "Freeze, motherfucker! Don't you move or I'll blow your fucking head off!" A cop came over and asked if we were okay, and we said no. He told us to stay right where we were and that they had gotten him. We saw them taking him to a cop car ahead of us, and he lunged towards our car as he walked by. The cops roughed him up pretty good over that. I worked the only grocery store in town, and I saw the officer that talked to us that night. I asked what was wrong with the guy, and the cop kind of laughed and said he was planning on killing you guys that night. He was hyped up on meth and always wanted to kill someone, and that night, it happened to be us. Sorry this was so long, but it's a true story. And meth head guy, let's not meet again. My Scary House, submitted by Scuttlebutt61. Growing up, I became familiar with the paranormal pretty fast. I can't say anything about what happened before I was 6 or 7 and started to notice things were strange around my house, but I'm sure I noticed a lot of things before that. I grew up in a village in Georgia with my parents, my older brother, and my little sister. When I was 6, my brother, let's call him R, was 9 and my sister A was 4. My dad had a good business job but was away on work a lot. He was a successful salesman. My mom was a stay-at-home mom at this time but took a job a few years into my story when A was at school full-time. Our house was a big old mansion with 5 bedrooms, sitting rooms, a library, and even servants' quarters that we used as an office for my dad and kind of a play space for us. We had a home gym out there, and that's where we had our Super Nintendo and Sega and stuff like that. I think that's the place where I started to notice something was strange at our house. And my brother might have seen things more than he let on, but we didn't know at the time. He told me later. When I was 6, my brother and I were playing in the back house. Just video games and listening to music and probably fighting. That's when we both heard a noise from a room that we used as storage. It came off the room we were in. It sounded like a knocking sound, and R got up and switched off the stereo and told me to pause the game. We sat quietly, and then the knocking came again. It was definitely coming from the closet. R got up and opened the door and pulled the string for the overhead light, and there was nothing in there but boxes and stuff like that. He said out loud, "Maybe it's mice or something," and moved some things around. He came back and shrugged and said there could be something in the walls, or maybe it was our dad doing something. We went back to playing the game with the stereo off, and after a little while, the knocking came again, but this time it was much louder. It was more of a pounding. Our dad, who was home at that time and in the gym, came over and asked us what we were doing. We said we thought it was him making the noise, and that's when we heard the knocking again, and then scratching in the walls. "Might be a squirrel trapped in the wall," said Dad, and walked over to a wall where it sounded like the scratching was coming from. He tapped on the wall and nothing happened. He tapped harder and another scratch came, but this wasn't like the sound of animal feet running. It was a scratch that started at the ceiling and came down to the floor in one long sound. Dad cocked his head. R said maybe it was a ghost, and I said to shut up. I was getting scared. I was just a little kid. Dad went around outside and then up onto the roof looking for anything that could be making the noise, but even while he was out there, we could hear the knocking on the inside. It was still in the closet, but the scratching was in the walls out by us. When he came back in, Dad looked at both of us and said sternly, "Are you playing a joke on me?" He was serious and had his "I'm not messing around" look on his face. We both shook our heads and the knocking came again. We all stood there looking at each other, and then a massive boom rang out, and we jumped, it was so loud. "All right, everyone out," said Dad, and we headed out the door into the yard. I forgot to turn our game off and ran back in to do it, despite my dad yelling at me to come back. I turned the system off and turned around, and I swear I heard a low rumble, or maybe it was more like a low breathing. I ran back out and told Dad, and he said to get up to the house. He called his best friend, who was a police officer in our village, and B came over to check out the place with Dad to see what was going on. They searched all around the outbuilding, inside and out, top to bottom, but there was nothing, and no holes for animals to get in or anything like that. We were stumped. R and I wandered back out and went over to stand near Uncle B and Dad. We called all of my dad's friends Uncle. And they were talking about what could be making the noise. Uncle B said that it was probably just an animal trapped in there, and to call the local pest guy. It was just turning to dusk, and that's when the lights went on in every room of the outbuilding. We all looked wide-eyed at it, and B walked back inside. He called for my dad, and he went in, and they were both in there for quite a while. And R and I talked about what was happening and kept saying that it was a ghost. Suddenly, they both came running out, with Dad slamming the door behind him. They were both white as sheets, and I'll never forget that. "Get on back to the house," said Dad to us, and we all went up to it. I turned around when we got to the back porch and said, "Dad, the lights are off." The rest of them turned around, and sure enough, the lights in the outbuilding were now off. We went inside while Dad and Uncle B stood talking. Mom was finishing dinner, and we were telling her what was going on, and she just smiled and said we were being crazy with imagination. No matter how much we told her, Dad saw and heard the stuff too. She told us to just wash up for dinner and quit playing at ghosts, but stopped mid-sentence staring out the back window. R and I looked out there, and the lights in the building were flicking on and off real fast. Uncle B and Dad stood looking at it, and then Dad came inside and went down to our basement where the breakers were. He flicked the power off to the outbuilding, and everything stopped. When he came up, Mom asked him what was going on, and he said he thought there was some electrical problems causing some strange things to happen. Uncle B left and we had dinner, me and R wanting to talk about things, but my dad told us to stop it and let it go. He would take care of it. He told us to stay out of there until he figured out what was going on. Nothing else happened for a couple of years, and it only remained in our conversations and a way to scare our friends who came over to visit. We would tell them all kinds of crazy stories about what was out there. But then, out of the blue, things started up again. It started with the lights, but the sounds came back, and this time they didn't stay out in the outbuilding. Things were happening at the house. R was 13 now, and one night had some friends staying over on a weekend. They were fooling around and not letting me join them, and I was being the bratty brother trying to get them to let me into R's room. That's when one of R's friends started screaming that someone was in the window looking at them. He said he saw a dark shape with sort of a face pressing up against the glass. But it couldn't have been a person. I mean, this was on the second floor, and there was no roof out there. The kid got so scared he wanted to go home, and his mom came out and got him. R told my parents what he had seen, and my mom looked at my dad but didn't say anything. I asked my brother if I could sleep with him and his two other buddies because I was scared again, and he said sure. Later that night, as the guys were all talking, my sister was asking my parents why there was yelling and screaming earlier, and they were comforting her, telling her we were just fooling around. I heard all of this because I went for a glass of water. And then I heard my mom say something like, "See, I knew something was happening. It sounded just like the thing I saw when you were at the movies last week." She was talking to my dad, not me. Dad was quiet, and then said there had to be an explanation for what was happening. But that night it got worse. In the middle of the night, A started screaming about a black thing in her room, and all us guys heard my parents go into her room and calm her down, but she wouldn't. She finally went into their room, and the rest of the night was quiet. Again, things died down for a couple of years, but they came back when I was 14 and R was getting ready to leave for the Marines. We were sitting outside on our porch just talking about baseball and chicks and his excitement to serve in the military. We were looking at the outbuilding. "You know, I never told you this, but I used to see things out there," he said. "Really?" I asked. "Like what?" He then went into this story about how when I was really little, he would go out into the yard and see shapes of people in the building looking out at him, and there was this one black shape that always put its hands up onto the windows. He was about 6 at the time, and wasn't scared, but he knew he should be. He told me he had told Mom, but she said he was just fussing and probably angry he wasn't the only child anymore. And that's when I went in there one day before Dad had fixed it up for us. It was dirty and dark, and when I went in, I heard knocking and scratching, just like we did together. Remember that? I said, yeah, and he told me that's when he went in. The door shut behind him, and the noises got really loud, so he ran out, and he never told anybody about it. Like something out of a movie, the lights came on in the outbuilding, but no one else was home but us. R looked at me and said, "I'm not scared of the military, but I'm scared of that." The lights started flicking on and off again, and then the lights in the house started up too. Being older and not as scared as kids, but still scared, we ran into the house and the front and back doors started opening and shutting on their own, over and over, and that breathing I heard when I was little was in the house, and it was really loud. R kept trying to turn the lamps and overhead lights off, but they just kept flicking on and off, and we heard heavy footsteps moving around upstairs. They seemed to be racing up and down the hallway and in and out of every room, and I said we should get out of there. The steps started coming down the stairs. So we ran out the front door, and R held it from shutting, and we launched out into the front porch. The door slammed behind us, and just then my parents were pulling up with my sister from a Girl Scout meeting or whatever. Mom had a look of horror on her face, and Dad jumped out asking what the hell was going on. A started crying, and my mom said to my dad, "Look!" and pointed at the front living room window. There was the black shape everyone had seen except me. But there it was. No shit. Dad told everyone to get in the truck, and we pulled away from the house. He stopped at Uncle B's house and told him what was going on, and he said he'd go over and take a look, and Mom wanted to talk to our preacher. We were Baptist, but hadn't been going to church that much, so I wondered why she wanted to see him. Mom called him. Uncle B got back and said nothing was wrong at the house, other than the back door being left open by two ghosts he said he thought looked like me and my brother. But when we protested, he just said there was nothing out there. Mom told Dad our preacher was going to meet us back at our house, and while we didn't want to go and protested, except for my brother, we went back. He was a nice man and listened to all of us telling him what we had experienced over the years. He just sat there smiling, drinking coffee, and listened politely, and finally told us that we needed to pray and come back to church. He wanted to bless the house and walked around with my parents saying prayers and stuff and told us to call if we needed him. Nice, but it felt like he was just going through the motions. Everything was quiet again for a bit, but one night we all woke up to screaming coming from downstairs and the footsteps racing around. A was sleeping in my room now, and she jumped on me really scared as we listened to my dad yelling at it to go away and saying the Our Father prayer. The next morning, Mom had had it. She wanted to leave for a while, and Dad wanted more answers other than prayers. This was around 2002, so the ghost hunter craze was in full glory, and Dad printed out tons of information from groups that claimed to be Ghostbusters. I remember reading some of it and thinking some of these people looked a few bricks shy of a load, and actually laughing at the prospect of some clowns coming into our house, thinking they'd see a chair slide around or something, and maybe hear some voices through a bunch of static. I mean, that was all that was on their websites. Dad took a chance with one group, and said they were free and wanted to help, but when they got to our place, they wanted to be alone in the house, and Dad said, "Yeah, right," and sent them packing. He wasn't just going to let strangers wander around and probably steal stuff. Another group came out to talk to my parents first, and then wanted to do an overnight investigation with cameras and recorders, all the stuff you see on the TV shows. They did, and while we didn't notice anything, they shared some EVPs with us the next day, but I honestly didn't hear anything. R was leaving for BT, and I was sad to see him go. Things were quiet again, but when he came home right after he finished BT, the same crazy stuff happened again. But now there was this really eerie sound coming from the outbuilding, and the light show out there was so fantastic, Dad broke down and called the power company and the fire company, convinced that something physical was making all of this happen. Mom grabbed my sister and told me to come with her, and that they were going to my grandparents' house an hour away, and I wanted to stay. Dad said to go with them, but I said no. It was the first time I had ever said no to him, and he got really pissed. That's when R said he'd met a guy at camp that had something similar happen to him at his house growing up. He had told him about this skeptic group that came out and found out all these rational explanations for everything, and it all stopped or went away with some simple fixes to wells, drafty windows, and stuff like that. I thought this was a little beyond that stuff, and so did Dad, but after Mom just left, he said he'd look into it. Mom and Dad fought all that night on the phone, and the noises started up again in the house. We couldn't sleep, and by now R and I were trying to record everything, but when we played tapes back, nothing was there. The next day, Dad looked the group up on the internet and called the people. They were from a state over, but not super far away. They were interested in what was going on and said they would visit us if we would have them. And Mom was still calling Dad, telling him we needed to just sell and get out of the house. She wasn't coming back. but he convinced her that these people might be able to help. 4 people came out that next weekend and spent the next 2 days in and around our house, both during the night and the day. They took tons of pictures, videos, recordings. They measured all kinds of distances, wanted to see any surveys of the land we had, and on and on. One of them did nothing but research our village, looking for property deeds, underground streams, where the airplanes flew over, you name it. It was nothing like the other group. Someone was always at our place, too. I think to make sure we weren't trying to trick them. They asked all of us tons of questions, alone and together, looking for something. Maybe to see if we were lying, I don't know. While they were there, nothing happened. On Sunday evening, though, they sat down with my dad at our dining room table and went over all the stuff that they had found, which was basically nothing. There was nothing out of the ordinary about the land, the house, the surrounding area. There wasn't even any folklore in the area to speak of. My dad just nodded while they talked, and that's when the footsteps started racing upstairs. 2 of the investigators ran up there while the footsteps charged around, and we could hear the guys yelling to the people downstairs to get some kind of equipment or whatever, and then we could hear the bedroom doors opening and slamming shut. The breathing sound was back, but only upstairs, and the other people rushed up there, and R and I made a move to go up, but Dad shook his head no. Suddenly, there was a ton of screaming, and it wasn't just the stuff we had heard in the past. It was the investigators yelling and shouting at each other. One guy started screaming, "Get it off me! Get it off me!" And we heard the crazy footsteps come flying down the stairs and by us out the back door. We all felt the breeze as it went by, whatever it was. Everything was silent upstairs now, but the lights in the outbuilding were going crazy and the door to it was opening and closing. And then it just stopped. Dad went upstairs and we could hear voices talking for a long time before they all came down. The people gathered up their stuff and said they'd put together a report and call my dad in a day or 2. That never happened. We never heard from them again, and my dad called and emailed, but they never answered and they never wrote back. We never saw a report of any kind. R went back to the service, Mom came home, and Dad finally said we were selling the place, and we did. Nothing happened while we waited for a buyer, and nothing's happened to any of us since we moved out. This was a long time ago, and I've got my own family now, and nothing's happened to them or me. We all still talk about it when we get together, but I think we all just put it out of our minds for the most part. So, that's my story, long but true. This took me a long time to write down over a bunch of days, and I keep remembering other things, but none of it is that big, so I'm sending this as is. There wasn't any exorcism or bleeding walls or any of that kind of thing, but that was one messed up place, that's for sure. Now that I've written this, I wonder if the people who bought it saw anything, or anyone else after that had ever lived there maybe saw something too. I can't say, and I guess it doesn't really matter. We lived through it, and that's enough for me. The Run, submitted by Tantalist Flower. This took place in my hometown when I was 17 years old and in high school. It was springtime, and this guy who was known for having these crazy keg parties at his house when his parents went out of town was doing just that, throwing a big party. A bunch of my friends and I were invited, and who could say no to $3 for unlimited crappy beer until it ran out? Before I go any further, I should say that I'm a woman, and this was 1991. A group of my friends were getting together, and one, I'll call Angie, was going to drive us all and stay sober enough to drive us home. We all got to the party and went inside to see our friends and have a good time. The guy whose house it was, I'll call him Alan, was making the rounds to say hi to everyone and was doing the good host thing by telling us everyone who was there, including some guys from our sports rival school. We all did the "aw, shit" thing and then laughed. One of them was a guy I worked with at a fast food place, so I thought that was cool that he was there. We got cups and beer and wandered around to see people playing drinking games and others hanging out around the pool. It wasn't open, but people were still sitting in chairs and talking and stuff. The guy I knew, I'll call him Joe, saw me and came over and started talking to us, and pretty soon some of his friends followed. They were all really funny, and some ran to get us new drinks. They were clearly hitting on us, but I wasn't interested as I had a boyfriend, and Joe knew that, so it was mostly them flirting with my friends. My guy, I'll call him Jay, couldn't go to the party because he had to watch his brother and sister. And no, he wasn't like one of those psycho guys who was jealous if I was out without him. In fact, he used to drive me crazy because he would always say, "I don't care who's hitting on you. You know who butters your bread." At any rate, the night went on and we started playing a drinking game. I don't remember which, but some girls I don't know came over to us and started acting really bitchy. Turns out, they came with these guys and were pissed they were hanging out with us and not them. Not wanting any trouble, I got up and went inside to see who else was there, and by the time I went back, there was a decent shoving match going on with all the moron guys in the yard yelling, "Hit her! Hit her!" One of my friends, I'll call her Crystal, was really getting into it with one of the girls, and she threw a beer in her face. And that was it. They started fighting, and then the rest of us jumped in to stop them. Angie got to Crystal first and pulled her away and dragged her screaming into the house. Alan came out and told everyone to keep it down or we'd get busted, and things went back to normal pretty quick. Well, sort of. We were supposed to leave around 11:30, and just before then I went looking for Angie. She was nowhere to be found. I looked all over and finally found a friend who told me that she had left about an hour earlier, right after the fight broke out. What the hell? My friends had ditched me. Now, it wasn't the end of the world. I only lived about 2 miles away, but now I had to hoof it on my own. Kind of pissed, I said goodbye to some friends and let them know I was heading out. This place was on the edge of my town, and it would be a little bit before I got to neighborhoods, and the only light was from the occasional streetlight as I stuck to the shoulder. About 10 minutes into my walk, I heard a car coming up from behind, and I made sure I was way over and out of the way. When it got up to me, it slowed down, and I heard a voice say, "Isn't that one of the bitches from the party?" I turned to look at the car, and it was the girls who started shit with Crystal. Great. Just great. I kept walking as the car stayed right at my pace, but started to veer over towards me, until I could almost feel it touching me. "Want a ride?" said a drunken voice from inside the car. I was trying to be cool, so I just said, "No, but thank you." The car took off like a shot and went around a curve, tires screeching. I shook my head and kept going, and I could see the regular neighborhoods would be starting in just a bit. In just a couple of minutes, though, I saw headlights of a car turn around a far corner and head my way. The lights got bigger and bigger, and that's when I realized it was coming right at me and was not slowing down. I took a leap off the shoulder and into some tall grass across a ditch and fell down. The car sped by me and I looked back at it. It was the girls again. I got up and started running as fast as I could. I was a multi-letter track athlete, so this was right up my alley, but I was scared more than thinking about pacing myself. The edge of the houses was getting closer, but not fast enough, and when I looked over my shoulder, the car was making its way back to me. I kept running and running, and as the car got closer, I could hear it, and I could also hear the girls laughing. I kid you not, they were all laughing. I reached the first stop sign of the neighborhood and made a right turn onto the street, and just as the car blew through the stop, I turned and ran another 180 in the other direction. I suddenly remembered that there was a convenience store not that far away in that direction. I don't know how I remembered it, but it popped into my head. I kicked it into high gear, and the car was behind me again as I ran with all I had. Everything was a mix of fright and adrenaline as I pushed towards the store. The car and I hit the parking lot at the same time, but they kept going. I kept going to the payphone and then frantically looked for a dime in my little wallet I kept with me. I dialed my boyfriend, and he answered quickly, and I told him what was going on, and then screamed as the car pulled into the parking lot and right up to me with the high beams on. He told me to stay there, and that he was coming, but the car just sat there with the lights blaring on me. Just then, another car pulled into the lot, and the guys from the party got out, and I could tell some were more than just a little drunk. They took one look over at us and stopped their laughing. They came over, and the girls got out, and they started this really loud shouting match between them. Joe saw me, came over and asked if I was okay, and I nodded and told him my boyfriend was on the way. Just then, the store guy came out and started yelling at everyone that he was going to call the cops. While all that was going on, Joe put his jacket on my shoulders and started walking me away from the lights and trouble. I told him what had happened and we kept walking. While I was running, I seriously thought I was going to die, and I told him so. We got up another block, and I saw my boyfriend's dad's car. His little brother and sister were in the back seat looking dazed and sleepy. I opened the door and he said, "Howdy, strangers, need a lift?" He was always fucking around and making jokes out of everything. He motioned for Joe to get in too, and then he took the first turn away from the store as we could see police car lights coming down the street. Jay asked where Joe lived, and he took him back to his house and was asking him if he played any sports. They were just bullshitting as I was going crazy, telling them what had happened was serious and I should call the police. "I'm still drunk," said Joe. "No cops until later, okay?" My boyfriend laughed, and Joe got mad and said, "What, never been drunk before?" We took him home, and he thanked us, saying that Jay was a nice guy and that I should keep him for life. "She knows who butters her bread," my boyfriend said, and finally took me home. I have never been so scared in my life, and still thank Jay for getting me home so fast. And for all you pervs, yes, the next night on our date, he buttered my bread. My Time as a Security Guard, submitted by SC Thunder. I worked 12 years in security, and I'm currently an assistant manager for the firm I work at. Here's a few scary situations that have occurred in my years as a guard. My first assignment was guarding an industrial shop that repairs mining equipment. The shop is located next to multiple businesses in a graveyard, which is rumored to be haunted. The workers would tell me that they would see shadow people and an old-world train conductor walking through the shop during the late-night hours. When they told me their stories, I was already there for a few years, as it took them a while to feel comfortable to talk to me. During those years, I have never seen or heard anything until one night I was doing my walkthrough of the shop. I heard a ratchet wrench cranking. I paused as no one works past 4 p.m. and the time was 2 a.m. So I walked towards the noise and nothing was there. The noise continued and I laughed, thinking somebody was pranking me. I walked to the outside to see if someone was on the outside of the shop, but nothing. I returned to the location and the noise continued, so I just said, "Keep up the good work," and I continued on my rounds. After 6 years at the shop, I was promoted to road patrol. My job is to patrol all the sites that belong to the firm, and I was scheduled for night shift, and I loved it. Some of the sites we check are located in the middle of nowhere. One night, at about 3 a.m., I was riding up an isolated road in the middle of the woods. I drove up a large hill and came to a stop sign where I can turn left onto a rural road, which you have to have a 4x4, or right where there are well pads and farms with a newly paved road. On the left, I noticed a black Charger sitting with its lights off, and I thought to myself, no way would I drive that on those crappy roads. As I began to turn right, the person in the Charger begins waving to me to drive towards its vehicle. I was like, nope, and I made my turn, and as I made my way around a hillside, I saw the Charger speed up behind me, flashing its brights on and off. I continued on my route as I approached another stop sign. I stopped and saw the owner of the Charger get out, and he slowly walked up towards my driver's side window. I put my Tahoe in drive and left the driver of the Charger in my dust. I turned down a road where my 4x4 was needed, and I looked in my rear-view mirror to see if the Charger was following, in which it did come up to the road, stopped and backed off the road I went down, and then drove down the paved road. That told me the driver knew the area, and for the rest of the night I didn't see the car, and I didn't care to know what he or they wanted. A couple of years later, I was still on road patrol and managed to get my friend RC hired. He also worked as a road patrol guard. One night I was in the office eating lunch when RC called to tell me that outside our office gate was a pickup truck parked to the side of the road and he wanted backup. We did that as one of us would talk while the other guard wrote down the plate number. I took lead as I drove up to the pickup truck. It had tinted windows and dragon designs on the side, and they were colored dark green with 10-ply tires. I was expecting a couple of teenagers looking for a quiet place to do teenager things. I rolled down my passenger side window and asked if they were okay. The driver in the truck rolled down their window, and a woman and a man in their late 50s greeted me. I smiled and again asked if they were okay. The lady said in a weird tone, "We are fine, just driving around." The hairs on my neck immediately went up as my gut was screaming that something wasn't right. I replied, "Okay, I thought you were broken down and this is a lonely road." I began to roll my window up and the lady repeated herself in the same tone. "We are fine, just driving around." I said, "Okay," and before I could put my window up, the woman asked, "We aren't from around here. Could you tell us where this road leads to?" She asked, still talking in a creepy low tone. The man in the passenger seat never took his eyes off me as he stared at me like a wolf staring at a baby deer. I told them where the road went as my gut continued to scream at me to get the hell away from them. She just grinned and nodded and they drove off. My friend and I followed to make sure they didn't pull into the no trespass zones that we patrolled. And for someone who didn't know the area, she sure maneuvered around the turns as they disappeared from our sight. I talked to my friend and he said the plate was West Virginia, and we both agreed there was something off about them. And why would they drive to Ohio at this time of night? We searched the area where they parked but never found anything. Anyway, everyone, be careful out there, because you never know who you'll meet on the road. Who Was He? Submitted by India Inky. First off, I'm a 28-year-old actress and I live in Hollywood, California. I grew up just outside of LA, so I'm familiar with the area. My parents are both lawyers in the entertainment business, so I'm also familiar with many people in music and movies, and I've been spoiled enough to meet a lot of famous people. No, I'm not famous, but I like what I do, and hey, you never know. My friend just told me about your channel, and that you read stories like mine, so here I am. And after listening a bit, I think what happened to us is right up your alley. About 3 years back, my friend, let's say her name is Amy, told me she got invited to a party up in the hills and that she wanted to bring me. There was supposed to be a lot of industry people at it, and she thought we could meet some and maybe get some more work. I didn't really need it as I have a lot going on, but she banked a lot on a couple of projects that fell through and was looking for anything other than going back to waitressing in the shop she used to work in. I said sure. We got all dressed up and splurged on an Uber Black to get to the place. The house was huge, like I knew it would be, and it was a warm night even for the winter, so there were people in and out all night. Amy was right. There were a number of influentials at the party. She was really working it and having some great conversations with the right people. And that's when I noticed a guy across the room, and he caught my eye. I am a very confident person. My parents raised me to be, and when I look back at the guy, he didn't look away, and neither did I. He was very good looking, but looked out of place somehow. His suit was really expensive, and he kind of reminded me of Tyler from 21 Pilots. We just stared at each other for at least 10 or 15 seconds, and he finally got up and went out a door on the other side of the room, and I thought, well, that was funny. So the party was still going on, and Amy came over to tell me some news about a contact she just made, and these two hotties came over to us and started talking. We all got some champagne, and man, everything at these parties is always super high-end, and we're so spoiled being there because we're really just peons to these people. But we started talking some more with these guys. One guy, let's call him Eric, was talking to me most of the time, and the other guy, let's say Jared, was focused on Amy. They were brothers and musicians and actually lived up the street from this house. Super rich guys that lived in their father's house while he was living in the Caribbean or something like that. They were really funny and really nice, and we enjoyed hanging out with them and were getting a little tipsy. Every now and again I would look around and see the other guy, but every time I tried to point him out to Amy, he would be gone. I'm not going to drag out the rest of the party, but Jared was really hitting on Amy by midnight, and she was going for it. She needed to go to the bathroom, and when we got in there were a bunch of women snorting a ton of cocaine, and they offered us some. I won't lie, we both did a line, and it amped us up a bit. That's when Amy told me the guys wanted to go back to their house and hang out. And right away I was skeptical. I mean, they were cool and all, but I'm not stupid. Two young rich guys, we barely know them. I mean, it could go really bad, I said to Amy. But she was convinced they were okay. She kept saying, look, they live right up the street, we have our cell phones, our friends and even our parents know we're here. I was still not cool with it when we went back to the party, but we hung out some more and I was starting to think maybe it would be okay to go with them. But first I texted my brother and let him know where I was going, and to text me every hour for the next few just so we could stay in contact. He was cool with this plan as he was laying low at his apartment that night. He lived over in Silver Lake, and that wasn't too far away. We had another glass of champagne and then said okay to Jared's next invitation to go back to their place. It was something like 5 houses down, but it was another Hollywood Hills palace for sure. So we went in, and the guys led us outside to their pool, and they turned on the lights. The view was incredible, and they disappeared to get some drinks, and Amy and I were just giggling about the guys. At this point, I was buzzing but not drunk, and I was relaxed enough, even though I had been on edge earlier. Eric and Jared came out with a bottle of Cristal, 4 glasses, and 2 guitars. Eric popped the bottle open, and we all had a glass while they proceeded to play us some songs they had written. In all fairness, I don't remember if they were that good because the champagne was going to my head, but at the same time, not really. Then things changed. I remember standing up saying I needed to go to the bathroom, and things were getting cloudy. I also remember being in a room with couches and everything looking like it was in slow motion. I saw Jared on top of Amy on a couch on the other side of a fireplace, and I could see she was struggling, but again, everything was in slow motion. For a second, I realized that my fears were correct earlier, and that I was in trouble. And that's when I felt Eric get on top of me, and he started to take off my clothes. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak, but I knew what was happening. Now, this is where things go from terrifying to holy shit. I'm trying to scream, but I can't. I mean, I'm about to be raped, and so is Amy. Then the lights went out. I mean, pure darkness. It wasn't like the lights got turned off. I mean, the entire room went black. One minute I could see this guy's face leaning down towards mine, and then it was just gone. Then the lights came back on just as fast as they went off, and I remember looking at Amy, and this thing standing over her and Jared. I say thing because it was big, like 8 feet tall big. It was all black with its back to me, and it reached out to Jared with one hand and picked him right up off the couch and held him in the air. I felt Eric get off of me, and I think he yelled something, but this thing just literally threw Jared across the room into a wall, and while everything was all swimmy, I cannot forget the thump and crunch his body made when it hit the concrete wall. The thing turned around and caught Eric by the neck and did the same thing. I knew this was crazy. The guys had to be like 180 pounds apiece, and they just got ragdolled by this thing. That's when I got shocked into full consciousness. The thing turned to me, and it was the guy from the party. I shit you not, I'm not lying. It was the 21 Pilots looking guy, but he was just huge now. He or it or whatever it was standing there staring at me for the second time that night. It was another 10 to 15 seconds of staring, and then he walked over to some glass doors and went outside to the pool. I got up slowly and was a tad woozy. Amy was out like a light, and the guys were lying on the floor on the other side of the room. I stumbled my way out into the fresh air, and there he stood. I tried to say hello or something to get his attention, but that part I don't really recall. But this guy, thing, or whatever was back to regular size. He just turned around and said in a super deep voice, "They aren't dead. Get your friend. Get out. Call your brother." That's when his eyes flashed red. I swear on a stack of Bibles, his eyes turned red for a second. And there was an acrid smell in the air too, like rotting meat or maybe burning rotting meat. I can't really describe it, but it stunk. I backed into the house, more scared than sick at this point, and tried to wake up Amy. She did finally get up slowly, and I half dragged her out of the house and down the street. It was now like 3 in the morning and about a half hour after my brother's last text he sent, and just then another one popped up. I was bawling my eyes out as I called him and told him to come get us, and he said okay. Amy started throwing up and wailing, and about 15 minutes later a light came on, and a guy came out to see what the hell was going on. I told him we were okay and that my brother was coming to get us, and he just stared at us. 2 model actresses with smeared makeup, no shoes, one puking on his lawn, and both crying. He kept asking questions, and I just pointed to the house we came from and said the guys were bastards or something, and he walked over to it and stood out front. My brother pulled up a little bit later, and we were out of there. We never reported it. We talked about doing something, but I don't know how bad they were hurt, and what was I going to say about that? My brother was even having a hard time buying my story and actually went back to the house after he took us to his place. He said the front door was shut and locked, and no one answered the door. Amy and I were okay. Shaken up, but we were okay, so we decided to not go to the police. Anyway, the reason I bring this up now is because a few weeks ago I was with my fiancée at a place in North Hollywood, and there was a guy playing and singing. I recognized the tune and almost shit my skirt. I looked up, and it was the Jared guy at the microphone. He played a few more songs as I tried to tell the story to my man, and I hadn't shared any of it with him yet. I hadn't really described the guy/thing that saved us in detail. The Jared guy stopped playing, and he looked up at me, and his eyes got super wide. He quickly packed up his guitar and went out a side door of the place. My fiancée went to the bathroom and came back smiling and said, "You'll never believe this. I just bumped into the guy from 21 Pilots in the bathroom." I didn't say anything else about it. That's my story, and it's 100% true. I hope you'll share it. I don't know who or what that guy or thing was, but it was scary as hell even though he saved us. Anyone listening who might have an idea, I'm open to opinions. Village in the Middle of Nowhere, submitted by Dark Razor Scratch. A few years back, I was really into off-roading in my D90 and took my rig all over the place in Pennsylvania, up into New England, over to West Virginia, and so on. I did a lot of the official parks like Roush Creek, Paragon before it closed, Chaos Park, and tons of great places, people, and times. A few friends and I usually all went together with our different vehicles, Jeeps, Dodges, and some homemade rigs too. Weekends were full of technical trails and climbs, breakdowns, and a whole shitload of fun. None of the guys I went with were into the whole mudding thing, and I'm not knocking that, but just blasting through mud holes wasn't really our thing. One weekend we had planned fell through, and I still wanted to go do something, so I talked to my buddy Ken to see if he'd be up for at least an afternoon of off-road fun, and he was down. We planned on hitting up Chaos, leave early in the morning, have some fun, and then be back late that night. I packed a bunch of sandwiches, soda, and chips into the cooler, hit up a local coffee shop for some Joe, and then picked up Ken. It was still super early in the AM, and we were having a great time just talking and drinking our coffee, planning out the day's events. So we got to the park, hooked up with some other guys we'd met there before, and after a while of bullshitting and catching up, we spent the day playing in the woods and rocks and having a freaking blast. Late in the afternoon, we had a couple of beers and then stuck around talking shop. Before we knew it, it was dark and we needed to hit the road. One of the guys told me and Ken about a shortcut that should have gotten us home through this forest and saved us some time on the way home. Like total morons, we gave it a shot. Most of it was turn left at the stump you'll see on the right shit, and we scribbled that down on a piece of paper. So, off we went, looking for these weird landmarks, and after a while we're going down what basically were fire roads, when we got into what I thought was Virginia. The GPS was sketching out, and these directions were seriously shitty. Suddenly, we saw some lights up ahead, and we found ourselves driving into what looked like a settlement of some sort. There were trailers on cut lawns lining this fire road. Some had attached garages and carports, but all of them had lots of Confederate flags and such. Here and there, people were outside by fire pits, and with the windows down, the loudest sound was the crunching of my tires on the gravel. As we made our way through, people were coming out of their buildings and staring at us, and as we were getting to the end of this strip of trailers, about 7 big dudes stepped out onto the road blocking my D90. Ken looked at me and said, "What the fuck is this, man?" I told him to be cool as one of the guys started to walk over to my window. Ken looked back and hissed, "They're blocking the back too, man." I kept a smile on my face, and my hand left the gear shift and rested on my hip. That's where my holstered P30L sat. I kept my other arm resting on the window and watched as the guy moved towards me. He was wearing a sleeveless flannel shirt with a jean vest, and he had long hair and a big beard. He got up to my door and peered inside. "Evening," I said. He just looked at me and nodded and sort of mumbled nothing. "Is everything okay? We're just trying to get back to a highway and get home." "Where'd you come from?" he asked. I could smell beer and cigarettes on his breath. I told him we had been at Chaos Park, and that we were following bad directions home with a laugh. "What do you mean it's bad out here?" he asked. Oh shit, I thought. We're going to do the dick dance. Ken coughed, and I looked over to see another guy standing by his door. I said I simply meant the directions were screwy, and I didn't think we were on the right road. "Pretty fancy truck you have here. Cost a lot?" I laughed a little and said, "Actually, I bought it used in Florida and fixed it up myself. It's a Land Rover Defender 90. "I can read, boy," he said flatly. Second time I thought, oh shit. I looked at Ken, then looked at the guys standing on the road, and I couldn't help but notice 2 of them had rifles in their arms. "Pretty expensive?" he asked again. I told him how much I paid for it, and that the labor was more than the basic cost of it. "How about you letting me take a little test drive?" I smiled a thin smile and said, "I'm afraid my insurance doesn't cover that, my friend." "I ain't your friend, he said. "Come on out of there, both of you." I looked at Ken, and then back at him. Then I looked at the guys in the road, and to this day I can't believe what I did. Let me say this, I am not a fighting type of guy. I'm more of a quiet nerd than anything else, but I do hunt and shoot. I am an outdoors kind of guy, but I am the first guy to try to make peace with anybody in a bad situation. I stalled for a minute as he leaned right into the door and said, "Get out. Now." In a flash, I slammed my hand down on his arm that was now resting on the door window frame, and then ripped out the P30 and pointed it at his face. I was literally shaking about what I was doing, and even now as I write this, the hair on my arms is raising up. His eyes got wide, and I said, "This ends right now. Start walking with me. Ken, shift." I didn't take my eyes off the guy, but could feel Ken staring at me when he said, "What?" "Shift the fucking truck, Ken," I said, and lightly stepped on the gas, let up on the clutch, and we slowly started rolling forward, slow enough for this guy to walk with his one arm stuck under mine, looking into the barrel of my pistol. He didn't say anything. He was just breathing hard and slowly walking along with me. "Ken, tell those motherfuckers to back off and keep their rifles pointed down." He said, "What?" Oh, yeah. And then he yelled that out the window at them. They backed up and off the thin road. The dude was still staring at me and my pistol when I got to the edge of the clearing and slowed the D90. I let go of the guy's arm and said, "Sorry about that. We don't want any trouble." He just stared blankly and didn't say anything. I hit it and we lurched forward and took off into the darkness at a high rate of speed on that fire road. And that was it. No shots fired, no one racing after us, nothing like that. It felt like a dream as we plowed on until we came to a paved road, and I didn't even think to look at the directions or check my GPS. I just turned right and got the fuck out of there as fast as I could. Ken finally spoke up and said, "What the fuck do you think that was all about?" I shook my head, and he said we should probably tell somebody about that weird little colony, and I thought about it for a minute. "Brother, the local gendarmes are probably related to those guys or know all about them. Let's just get home." Turns out, overall, it wasn't a bad shortcut as we did get home pretty quickly, but I really wish the guys at the park had warned us about that place. The next day I looked on a map for what I thought was the closest town and called a state police barracks, but nobody answered the phone. I left a message about the strangeness of the night before, but I never heard back from anyone. We laugh about it now, but that night was the first and last time I ever pointed my P-30 at anyone, and I still can't believe I did that. I guess when push comes to shove, we're all capable of doing things we don't think we are.